This report following a story from Washington Post on Sunday that has uncovered the massacre of 83 Tigrayans in an internment camp in Merababa, southern Ethiopia. For more on this, we are joined by Desta Haileselassie, civil rights activist and a member of Tighat Media from Washington, D.C. Desta, welcome.
You so much for having me.
Desta, let's begin with your reaction. You've consistently been saying that members of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces who were detained right after the war broke out in November of 2020, what did you feel when you read the story from Washington Post on the massacre of Tigrayans?
Yes, as part of the Victims List compilation project we do at Tighat Media, I have been closely following up this story for about a year now, since December 2021. Soon after we heard about this heartbreaking massacre, we tried to approach a lot of international media outlets like the CNN, the BBC, the Reuters, the Associated Press, including international human rights organizations like the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. But they were not willing, for some reason, they were not willing to investigate and write story about this massacre. But finally, we approached the Washington Post, and they agreed to investigate it and write a report about it. And they released yesterday the report, the same report that you mentioned earlier. And this report covers very heartbreaking stories about 83 Tigrayan victims who were members of the Ethiopian National Defense Force. So, on behalf of these victims and my fellow Tigrayans, I would like to extend my gratitude to the journalist her name is Catherine, and her team at the Washington Post for bringing actually this heartbreaking story to into the spotlight of the international media mainstream. Yes, you're right. I have been repeatedly talking about this crimes for a long time, and the reason is just because I knew about these crimes. Over the past 2 years, a lot of crimes have been committed against ethnic Tigrans across many detention centers in Ethiopia, and I have been in contact with a lot of credible eyewitnesses, medical doctors, survivors, and family members of the victims.
Our reporters have verified that situations remain in Wendotika, southern Ethiopia, one of the imprisonment camps that remained even after signing of the peace deal. Desta, do you think there could have been a mechanism that would have prevented the death of those civilians?
I think it's always good to remember that the target against Tigrans, who were members of the Ethiopian National Defense Force, started way before the war on Tigray broke out, which means before November 2020. For example, you can take the assassination of General Sa'are Mokonnen and General Gazai Aberra, and the mass detention of Tigrayans who were members of the Ethiopian National Defense Force, and this was actually admitted by the Ethiopian government. For example, the Ethiopian general, if I remember his name correctly, Tesfaye Ayalo, publicly admitted that the Ethiopian government mass detained Tigrayans who were members of the Ethiopian National Defense Force. The heartbreaking story we read yesterday at the Washington Post includes stories about 83 ethnic Tigrayans who were members of the Ethiopian National Defense Force, and many of them were deployed in South Sudan, in Somalia, and other countries under the United Nations peacekeeping mission. So the United Nations as an organization had the right to protect the lives of these victims. It's not only the United Nations, including the Africa Union and the international community at large. Uh, Many ethnic Tigrayans actually refused to return from South Sudan to Ethiopia, and then they sought asylum in South Sudan. So that means the United Nations had full knowledge of what was going against the ethnic Tigrayans who were members of the Ethiopian National Defense Force.
And what do you think should be done right now to protect the remaining Tigrayans from further crimes?
What I think should be done now are three things, in my opinion. The first thing is that the United Nations and the African Union should seriously investigate the Ma'rab Baya massacre reported by the Washington Post yesterday. As far as my information is concerned, the Ma'rab Baya massacre was carried out under the full knowledge of the Ethiopian government, mainly the Ethiopian National Intelligence Unit led by Temesgen Trune. Number two, as per the peace agreement signed in South Africa and in Kenya, the remaining Tigrayan detains, be it civilians or those who were members of the Ethiopian National Defense Force, should be released. At least the United Nations and the African Union and the international community, they should demand for their release. Number three, it's a plea for the international human rights investigators that they should follow suit and right the crimes committed against Tigrans. If the international community failed to do these three things, in my opinion, now, I'm sure the government of Abiy Ahmed will continue to assassinate high-profile Tigrayans who are languishing in detention centers in Ethiopia.
All right, Desta, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me once again.